Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction series. Well, we put it up to a vote about a week ago on our members and Patreon pages, and the clear victor with both in a very similar vote, percentage-wise, out of the four choices that I gave everyone, was the Buddhist expansion by Extra History. I believe it's a 5-part series, so we'll do what we typically do with a 5-part series from Extra History. I'll do 2 episodes today, 2 tomorrow, and then the final one the day after that. As always with series, as a way of saying thank you to the support from our members and our patrons, the second and third episodes will each go up a day early on those platforms for those of you who are supporting us here. It's not that I don't appreciate every viewer, but it's just one little way that we can say thank you to those who are able to do that extra, which goes a long way to supporting this channel. A big chunk of what makes this channel possible is because of our support on those 2 platforms. So I'll put the link in the description below. As always, I encourage you to check out Extra History. They're one of my favorite history channels on this platform. They have a lot to offer, and I think it's all very good. I love the way they tell a story. I've mentioned before, I don't know a lot about Asian history, so I'm excited to learn myself, and I'll try to add some value to the commentary where I'm able to, just as I'm learning along the way with all of you. Let's go ahead and dive in. First, I want to say thank you to Casper Larson in Denmark. All the way in Denmark. I hope to get to your beautiful country one of these days. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. Let's check this out.
Demons came, clawing onto the earth realm at the call of their god. Some are blue-skinned and tusked, carrying war clubs, while others have fanged mouths in their bellies, breathe fire, or swim.
Let me just say how much fun it must have been for the artist to draw this stuff, because these are really cool looking images here.
Dismembered skeletons. Some use serpents as weapons, or have snakes emerging from their mouths. They swarm across the earth at the behest of Mara, the one who delights in destruction, god of desire, and the circle of death and rebirth. He marshals the demons mounted on his great war elephant, with weapons and fireballs in each of his 6 hands.
So, because I don't know a lot about Buddhism or Asian history, I'll try to find parallels where I can and try to talk about some things. And obviously, being a Christian and being a pastor who has gone to school for Bible and theology, I immediately, some things jump out at me here. For example, this god of desire that's bringing destruction. Well, in the Bible, it talks about that the origin of sin is desire that forms within us. And then that desire turns into action. And then when we act, that's sin. And then that sin eventually leads to spiritual death. So I can see those parallels right away with that.
For Mara has heard that a mortal is about to discover the eightfold secret, the thing that can stop the wheel of the cosmos, the cycle of death and rebirth that keeps humans in torment. So he sends his uncountable furies to swarm toward a tree in a land called India, and at the man sitting serenely below it.
The Buddha.
Thanks so much to Skillshare for helping to support today's historic tale. By the numbers, Buddhism isn't one of Earth's largest religions. At around 500 million adherents, it comes in a distant 4th place behind Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, whose populations number in the billions. Yet Buddhism is all around us. It's part of our everyday lives, from inspiring some of our favorite sci-fi franchises, to developing martial arts that millions practice, to being at the center of meditation apps that you might use to fall asleep. It's a tradition with a global reach, whose concepts and philosophies have influenced billions, whether or not they subscribe to it. Seriously.
And that's a fair point. And oh, look, Avatar. I'm actually watching the animated series with my kids right now. It's actually really, really good. We haven't started the Netflix series yet. But yeah, I've always understood Buddhism to be less a traditional religion and more almost like a philosophy, although there's certainly elements of both. So I can see why elements of Buddhism would find itself into culture and into places where people might not necessarily practice actual Buddhism, but might incorporate elements of it into their lives. That's true with other religions too. I mean, there's elements of Christianity that even people who aren't Christians would practice when it comes to their behavior and their philosophy of life and things like that.
Once you start looking, you can see it's all around us. Despite this, Buddhism is often misunderstood. partially because in its history, it has been many things. A flexible tradition, it alters and fuses with every culture it encounters, meaning that its practice changed significantly as it radiated out from the Indian core. In fact, images of the Buddha himself have changed as well, so the Buddha of India can look quite different from that of Japan or China. But as Buddhists tell it.
And that, again, that's true with Christianity, right? I mean, for a good chunk of time, at least in Europe, Jesus has been portrayed as this very European-looking guy with blue eyes and stuff. And obviously he was Middle Eastern, so he would have had much darker skin, very different features.
It all began in what is now southern Nepal. 6th century BCE. The day she became pregnant, the queen dreamed of a white elephant with 6 tusks entering her side. It's a sign, one of many, that the child in her womb is special. Even so, the birth is nothing like she expects. She doesn't go into labor, nor have contractions. Instead, the child arises unbidden from her side, landing upright on his feet. Taking 7 steps, with lotus flowers blooming beneath where he walks, he comes to a stop and declares, "This is my last rebirth." They named him Prince Siddhartha, meaning he who achieves his goal. And he was the hope of the Shakya dynasty, who wanted this new prince, Siddhartha Gautama, to lead them to glory. So, when a wise man examined the baby and declared, based on body marks, that the child would either be a great king or a great religious leader, his father had a clear
both?
preference. He would raise his son in royal splendor, surrounded by pleasure. Siddhartha wanted for nothing. He wore fine silks and earrings so heavy with jewels that the lobes of his ears permanently stretched. His days were full of fine food, parties, good company, and pleasures of all sorts.
So I'm just kind of thinking about this in my mind, just to put this in context of world history. We're talking before really the Roman Republic has grown to be a great power. This is before the Punic Wars. This is really even before the kind of pinnacle of Greek power. So it's kind of interesting to think about that in the context of what's going on in the world stage.
He married his most beautiful cousin and had a fine son of his own, learning the joys of parenthood. But the prince also grew up isolated, never having been told about sorrow, sadness, illness, aging, or death. Then one day, he went for a fateful ride outside the palace grounds and was shocked by what he encountered. First, he met a sick man. Then he met an old man, and most shocking of all to him, he saw the terrible stillness of a corpse wrapped in a funeral shawl.
Imagine if you, I don't know how old he was at this point, but imagine if your formative years, you've grown up without even understanding some of the basic concepts of life, like age, old age and death and sickness, and then having all of that exposed to you at one time. That would be a shock to the system.
In a single day, he'd beheld the suffering of humanity that he had been shielded from all his life. And only then, when he met a wandering ascetic walking along the road, did he realize that this was the path for him. Upon returning to the palace, Siddhartha renounced all his belongings, his possessions, his power, even his family, and left to find the answers for why people suffered.
Wow.
Now let's pause here for a moment, because I've seen your hand up since the whole miraculous birth thing, and I do know what you are probably saying right now. Matt, this doesn't sound exactly like history. And look, you are absolutely right. While historians generally agree that Siddhartha Gautama existed, actual details of his life are few and far between. We're not even sure whether he lived in the 5th or 6th century, though what we do know a little about is his times. Contrary to legendary accounts, the area probably didn't have a hereditary monarchy.
So one of the things that I always find interesting is that when we start talking about religious figures like the Buddha or Jesus or whoever it might be, or Moses, we immediately kind of, like a lot of people, especially people who aren't religious themselves, will kind of immediately go down the path of, well, we don't have any real history that these people even existed. I would only say that for a lot of non-religious figures, it's the same way. We have about as much evidence for their existence as we do for some of these religious figures. But we don't question the existence of non-religious figures because of that kind of, that natural kind of whiplash that we have against religious figures to say, well, oh, they couldn't have existed. let's face it, for a lot of the people that we just assume existed or that we just assume wrote certain things, the evidence is pretty thin for those things. It's sometimes only a couple of sources. And sometimes the sources we have, they're not only not original sources, they're sometimes hundreds of years removed from the original sources. And they're people who wrote down things that came from another source that came from another source. Sometimes they're third and fourth hand sources. And we accept them as being true without really questioning them. So I don't see any reason why we shouldn't accept that this guy existed, even if the information is flimsy or thin or not real concrete.
Siddhartha's family were likely aristocrats in what's known as the Shakya Republic, a political unit that governed a part of what is now the border between India and Nepal. In that system, aristocratic members of the Shakya clan, like Siddhartha's father, would gather in an assembly and vote on matters of war, legislation, and to elect leaders. Though this radical egalitarianism among the upper classes did not extend to those lower in the caste system ruling India at the time. Which does put an interesting spin on the legendary story of Siddhartha, whose religious preachings would emphasize equality, essentially bringing this elite egalitarianism to the poor.
And that's a big deal in this place. I mean, we're talking about this part of the world. Equality, I mean, most of the world at this point, there's no equality, but this is an area of the world where to this day there's real struggles with social classes and the idea of equality, more than in most places.
However, we know so little about the historical Buddha or the Shakya kingdom that all of this should be considered extremely speculative.
That's fair.
So with all of that in mind, let's get back to the story. Siddhartha lived years as an ascetic, starving himself until his eyes sunk in his skull and you could see the veins on his skeletal frame.
He wasn't the fat
But
Buddha?
this brought him no closer to the question of why humans suffered. In fact, he realized this was only the opposite extreme of his life in the palace. So, when a poor man offered him a bowl of rice, he took it. He would pursue a middle path, he decided. Moderation in all things. And after wandering, he sat beneath a boat.
Again, this is a concept, and granted, this is right about the time that most scholars believe that the first parts of the Old Testament are written down. There's debate about that, but I think, you know, even people who aren't necessarily believers in the Old Testament would say that that's about when it's being written. It's, you know, the Babylonian exile, things like that are happening. But again, similar concepts. The idea in Christianity of moderation is very much alive. Like, you know, if you read the Bible, there's nothing wrong, for example, with drinking alcohol. But drunkenness is a sin. It's that excess. Gluttony is a sin where eating is not a sin, that kind of thing.
Bodhi tree and meditated for 49 days. And on the 49th night, as he teetered on the edge of enlightenment, that's when the women came. 3 beautiful maidens, moving with unearthly sensuality, danced around him in an endless circle, each passing their licentious dance to the other as they beckoned Siddhartha to get up and join them. Oh, but he knew them to be the daughters of Mara, the god of pleasure, death, and rebirth.
Again, this is fascinating because the story of Jesus, how does Jesus' public ministry begin? He goes into the desert for 40 days where he's tempted by Satan. This is 49 days temptation with women.
If he joined them, the pleasure he felt would be illusionary and temporary. It would be a cycle of bliss, guilt, and emptiness. Heck, even the pleasure itself would be undercut by the knowledge that the high would lead to a low. So Siddhartha did not join them. Mara, furious, unleashed his army of demons to terrify Siddhartha out of his reverie. They clanged shields, fired arrows, and charged him with chariots. In response, Siddhartha calmly reached out and touched the ground to display his solidity in meditation. And in sympathy, the ground trembled in an earthquake that banished the demonic army, causing the horned beasts to flee in terror. And as the sun rose, the man who had been a prince opened his eyes, not as Siddhartha Gautama, but as the Buddha, the awakened one. He awoke from the illusionary dream of the physical world, its pleasures and its sadness, and he had had his great revelation. The answer to the question of suffering was the 4 noble truths. 1. Existence is suffering. Humanity was stuck in a cycle of death and rebirth, meaning an endless cycle of suffering.
Reincarnation.
To live was to experience sickness, pain, and death. Even a comfortable life was an illusion, as every joy begets sadness when it ends. And every moment of happiness is also a moment of sorrow, since we know the happiness is fleeting. The world is always moving, and everything is transitory. 2. The cause of suffering is desire. We suffer because we desire things. Desire to gain.
Hate leads to suffering. No, yeah, so you can see the parallels there in the world of the Sith in Star Wars. But yeah, I mean, that's right in line with biblical ideas on sin.
Them to hold on to them, to mourn them when they are gone. It is the nature of the world for things to come and go, and it is our own tendency to hold on to them that makes us suffer. Desire being an unquenchable thirst. 3. To end suffering,
Sinful
you
nature,
must end
yeah.
desire. And 4. The way to cease desire is to follow the Eightfold Path. Now, we're not going to go through every point of this, but these are 8 principles that can be broken down into 3 groups: moral behavior, self-discipline, and meditation. Directives that apply to everyone, but with a few stricter rules that apply specifically to monks. And as Buddha acquired all of this knowledge, sitting under that tree, he experienced the state of nirvana, where his desire was blown out like a candle flame. A state of peace where his mind no longer raced and he was free from worldly concerns.
I had no idea how much Christianity and Buddhism paralleled each other. You know, the idea of dying to yourself, dying to the sinful nature, and being born again, as Jesus describes it in John 3, so that you can live a life of holiness, which would be kind of like the state of nirvana, where you eliminate those desires and you live in a way that God has called you to. Interesting.
He could have stayed there, enjoying it forever, but he knew this was not his role. For he was to spread his insight as a teacher and ensure the whole world would be free from suffering. So Buddha arose from his nirvana, went to find his students, and the history of Buddhism began.
Serial killer monk is the next part of this. All right, that's interesting. Let's go ahead and dive into part 2.
Northern India, 6th century BCE. The wild man Angulimala tears through the jungle panting, a necklace of human fingers dangling from his neck. He's killed 999 people, ambushing them on the road and dragging them from houses, taking a finger from each. And he just cited...
And we talk about Jack the Ripper, who we believe killed 5 people.
His 1000th victim, an old monk. Yet no matter how hard he runs, he can't catch him.
How are you so fast, old man?
He shrieks.
I want your fingers. Stop! I must have your fingers.
I have stopped, the monk replies. And as impossible as it may seem, it's true. The monk stands immobile, yet as Angulimala runs, the land stretches between them.
It's a
I've
treadmill.
stopped the cycle of death and rebirth. Now you, Angulimala, why don't you stop? Humbled by this display of power and wisdom, Angulimala drops to his knees, presses his blood-stained hands together, and begs Buddha to take him as a student.
Wow. If this is true, this is like a hardcore story of redemption. I was talking to my friend Daryl Scott the other day, who founded Rachel's Challenge, and he's good friends with David Berkowitz. He's actually going to see him in a couple of weeks. And David Berkowitz, we know, is the son of Sam, serial killer from the summer of 1977, the summer I was born, who has become a preacher in prison, and definitely a story of redemption there. So it is possible.
Thanks so much to HelloFresh for continuing to help us bring history to the table. Now, you may have noticed in the first episode of this series, when we talked about how Buddha attained his awakening and discovered the Four Noble Truths, we included a few more gods and demons than in, say, our John Brown series. Well, that was a deliberate choice. See, we don't have many historical sources for Buddha's life. And actually, Buddhism isn't that interested in the historical Buddha. What's important to them is the meanings of these stories, rather than strict factuality. As a result, historians look at early Buddhism through the lens of oral history, analyzing these stories to extrapolate what the early Buddhist community looked like.
And listen, we should not discount oral histories. Going back again to what I said in the first episode about how a lot of people generally believe that a lot of the Old Testament was written down during the Babylonian exile and afterwards, which would put it hundreds of years after, say, the events of Moses or David, like in Exodus or 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. That doesn't mean that those, even if that's when they were written down, that doesn't mean those stories weren't passed down through oral histories, which, listen, I get we like to play the game where, you whisper something in someone's ear and by the time it gets to the other end, it's changed completely. Oral histories weren't like that. It was very, very important to these cultures that oral histories were passed down accurately. And there were people who were responsible for learning these stories and learning them correctly. It doesn't mean things didn't get changed here and there along the way, but we shouldn't throw something out just because it wasn't written down. It could still be very accurate.
Who joined? Why did they do so? And what made Buddhism attractive? Because it seemed to be very attractive. Within 45 years, Buddha would go from 10 close followers to a faith community of thousands. So why? I mean, that's the question that's at the heart of every academic history of a religious movement, right? Why did the Buddha's message appeal to people, spread, and endure when thousands of competing ideas died out? Buddhism, after all, did not arise in a land devoid of religious tradition. On the contrary, it was rich with them. Brahmanism, a historical religion that was a precursor to Hinduism, dominated the cradle of Buddhism. Not to mention that concepts such as reincarnation, the cycle of death and rebirth, and fulfilling your dharma, or righteously living out your societal role in castes, whether it be a soldier or laborer, etc., were already well established. And much of Buddhism would be an attempt to critique, evolve, or react against these concepts. Well, Brahmanism was weakening because it wasn't that spiritually fulfilling, a fact we suspect due to a large number of splinter groups arising at the time, from Buddhism to Jainism to ancient Hinduism and others that died out.
It shouldn't be a surprise that there are connections and parallels and similarities between different religions. That's absolutely true in any case. I've been talking about the parallels with Christianity and Buddhism, but I mean, just think about how Islam and Christianity both grew out of Judaism. They both trace, Judaism, Christianity, Islam all are considered to be Abrahamic religions in that they all have kind of family trees that run back to Abraham and the founding of the covenant that he makes with God. It's just a difference of how it descended from that point. So it doesn't surprise me that things are going to be drawn from different places. There's going to be parallels. There's going to be comparing and contrasting.
Most of which that appear to address an anxiety over reincarnation. But you might be thinking at this point, oh wait, why would people want to exit the cycle of death and rebirth? Living infinite lives sounds pretty great. Okay, but on the other hand, does it though? Think of it this way. Would you want to experience all of the highs and lows of life all over again forever? Sounds kind of exhausting to me. And also, it's important to remember that this was a time before modern medicine, where childbirth, aging, and sickness were extremely painful and dangerous. In fact, it was more normal to be sick than it was to be well. The mortality rate was high for children and women, and political instability.
Mortality rates, I mean, even up to 150 years ago in developed countries, was still pretty significant for kids. I mean, it was not uncommon if you had 10 kids for 3 or 4 of them to die before adulthood. It just depends. I mean, to give you a perfect example of this, my grandfather's parents, my great-grandparents, both born in Carter County, Kentucky, about 10 miles away from each other. My great-grandfather was one of 12 kids. He had one brother who died at like 16 from, I think, typhoid fever. The other 11 all lived to well into adulthood and even old age, into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. All 11 out of those 12. My great-grandmother was the youngest of 14 kids, and 7 of them died before they were 15 years old. 10 miles apart. Both families that were farming, very little differences. You just never know.
Spurred regular warfare. Oh, and then there's hell. Wait, did we not mention hell before? Because between each rebirth, you would be pitched into the realm of Yama, god of the underworld, and hellaciously tortured to burn off bad karma. Sidebar, this guy is Yama. Yeah, he's kind of a boss. So, with all of that said, you sure you still want to keep riding this cosmic Ferris wheel forever? But even outside wanting to become a monk and attain nirvana in this life, Buddhism still held appeal for the lay people as well. They were encouraged to meditate, to moderate their behavior, live by ethical codes, and maintain love for their family and community. Monks also worked in said communities as counselors, spiritual advisors, and teachers.
So you can see how this would be attractive to people, right? Even if you didn't necessarily sign on to the religious aspects of it, just the philosophy alone. I mean, if it makes your life better, if it makes the lives of people around you better, if it makes your community better, that's what should be focused on. And that's what Christianity is supposed to be. I know that for a lot of non-Christians looking at Christianity, it's easy to see the very outspoken people who are trying to get certain laws passed and control people's behaviors and things like that. But at the heart of Christianity, what it's supposed to be is loving your neighbor. It's caring for the widow and the orphan. It's making the community better. It's treating people well. And yes, it's also about living lives free of sin. And focused on God, but that should be attractive to people. In fact, in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, it talks about how the early Christian church enjoyed the favor of all the people. People saw Christianity as a net positive on their community. Not everybody saw it that way, and I'm sure not everybody saw Buddhism that way. But you can see how this would be a net positive on the community, and that would attract people.
In other words, Buddhist practice held immediate benefits in improving relationships and fostering an outlook ideal for coping with an ever-changing and sometimes chaotic world. After all, if everything isn't permanent, negative things and troubles will also pass. And the religions that last are the ones that do these things, that use ritual, moral, and theological codes to benefit the individual practitioners as well as their communities. And that community aspect was strong in Buddhism, since monks also worked as counselors, spiritual advisors, and teachers in their communities. This was by design, by the way. Buddha wanted to specifically tie the monks and lay people together. In fact, Buddhism is a religion dependent on urbanization, because you see, monks had many prohibitions. They couldn't harm sentient creatures, eat meat, or sleep in a soft bed, but most crucially, they couldn't handle money. Meaning without cities and towns, monks simply couldn't operate. Each morning, monks would go into the community with begging bowls. Then the community would donate food to them as a way to support their religious mission. And when the monk's bowl was filled, he would return and eat it all as his only meal. And this act engaged the laypeople in the upkeep of their religious community. Of course, some gave more, such as wealthy converts donating pieces of property for monks to use, thereby founding the first monasteries. Now, these donations helped worshippers build karmic merit, but they also mirrored Buddha's renunciation of worldly things and trappings. But then, for people who wanted to gain enlightenment as soon as possible, that very renunciation could also mean renouncing life and becoming a monk. And doing so, while difficult, could have great rewards, especially for people who needed a total change, like the finger-collecting serial killer that we talked about in the beginning of this episode. Buddha's conversion of Angulimala demonstrates Buddhism's promise of redemption.
That's true. I mean, that's like your star convert. That's the guy that you put out in front of people and say, look at what Buddhism did for him. If it can change his life, imagine what it can do for you.
Angulimala reform. The stories claim that that reformation was so total that he became spiritually reborn, attained nirvana, and worked miracles. In fact, Buddha himself declared that Angulimala, upon his death, had exited the cycle. It's a story that emphasized that not only can anyone redeem themselves in Buddhist belief, but that the eternally changing nature of the world offers hope. For if all is passing, then even someone in a state of what might be called evil can become good. Interestingly, though, the story is a bit more complicated. One morning, when Angulimala went out to beg for food, several of his victims' family members broke his bowl and beat him. Then when he asked the Buddha why this was allowed, even though he was spiritually reborn, Buddha informed him that even though he'd repented, the harm of his violence could not be undone, nor the karmic consequences.
Right, that's a great point to make, is that just because you have changed doesn't mean there aren't continued consequences for your actions. It's like the difference between forgiveness and pardon. I can forgive someone of their actions toward me. And that's really about me. Forgiveness is a me thing. It's about my heart. It's about my attitude. It's about the way I view that person. Pardon is different. So if you, let's say, murder a family member of mine, I may or may not be able to forgive you of that Forgiveness is about me letting go of the hate and anger I have toward you. That's a me thing. Pardon would be saying, oh, you shouldn't suffer any consequences. That's different. I can forgive somebody but still want them to be held accountable for their actions. So this guy may have changed his attitude, but the consequences of his choices and the things he's done to other people, those haven't gone away.
That's a surprisingly modern idea of reconciliation.
Yeah.
In Angulimala, we also see a man seeking out Buddhism as a way to atone for violence, and perhaps some other early adherents were doing the same. Because as we'll see later, when we discuss Chinese Buddhism and Kung Fu, this religion will come to hold a special appeal for former soldiers. Others were likely attracted to Buddhism's egalitarianism. For instance, among Buddha's inner circle was Umpali, a poor barber who Buddha ordained as a monk alongside princes, showing the movement's rejection of the caste system. Buddha also permitted an order of nuns, though in truth only after his aunt hounded him to do so for 5 years. However, he insisted that nuns follow even more rules and would rank lower than the lowliest monk. Women, he believed, belonged with families and were too emotional to excel in monastic life. Despite this somewhat insulting inclusion, Buddhist nuns would go on to use even this restrictive role to exercise power and influence. For 45 years, Buddha lectured and built his community, and by the time he was old and suffering from back pain, he had thousands of followers divvied into 6 schools. Supposedly, his cousin had even briefly founded a breakaway group. But then, one fateful day, he ate a meal donated to him, got sick, and died in meditation, passing into parinirvana. Which is a pretty low-key way to go by the standard of religious founders' deaths, if you think about it.
That's
Usually
true.
They're executed for their beliefs, or they ascend directly to heaven or something. He left instructions for his body to be cremated, with his mortal remains built into a mound known as a stupa. But while his wishes
Do we
were
know
clear,
where it is?
his sudden absence presented a problem. During his life, the Buddha had spread his message orally, which was fine when he was available to settle disputes or clarify his ideas. But with him now gone, the community realized they needed to commit his message onto paper,
there
lest
you
it
go.
be lost in a game.
Again, parallels here with Christianity. The story of Jesus ends, and then in the decades that follow, his followers start writing all of that down.
Of telephone. It's said that they called for a conference of all 6 schools. There, Buddha's personal attendant Ananda, who had a flawless memory, told episodes of the Buddha's life and recalled his teachings. Meanwhile, the former barber Upali, who had memorized all of the rules of monastic life, recited them so they could be recorded. And these formed the first written doctrines of the Buddhist spiritual movement. Also, this was only, at least by tradition, the first of these conferences. A second would come about a century after Buddha's death. Though, by that time, Buddhism had split into 18 different schools,
Wow,
including
really?
one, Theravada, which still exists today. Yet an even greater split was coming. One that would help Buddhism spread across Asia, and its key figure would not be a monk, but a king.
Okay, so I was doing a little bit of reading about it, and apparently there are like different places that claim to have some of Buddha's ashes, including one that was found not too long ago. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just one place that his ashes were placed. That's pretty interesting. So that was really enlightening, so to speak. I learned a lot there, and as I said, episodes 3 and 4 will be next, and we will have those up later today for our patrons and members. It'll be live for everybody else tomorrow. In the meantime, I want to say thank you to Nathaniel in Windsor, Colorado, and Michael in Overland Park, Kansas. Thank you guys so much for your continued support on Patreon. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.